controversy is something that's never really very far away from fashion. So a few years back, you had former Education Secretary Nicky Morgan. She attacked Theresa May's choice of £995, Amanda Wakely luxury trousers, leather trousers. Now particularly, it turned out that Morgan too, though, had spent a similar sum, this time on a Mulberry designer bag. And while sexist double standards often inform commentators' judgments about male and female politicians' dress sense, David Cameron was never criticised for wearing 4,000 ago Savile Row suits. He was actually, as we can see, more than happy to flaunt his class privilege, his class entitlement, when in a parliamentary debate about the NHS, he told Jeremy Corbyn to put on a proper suit, do up your tie and sing the national anthem. So as well as exposing Tory claims to be the new party of workers, the so-called Jams, just about managing, the May versus Morgan spat in particular revealed the dark side of fashion. For an industry which trades on images of beauty, creativity, seductively marketed to offer an escape from the shadow cast by austerity and the increasingly grim realities of work and home, the revelation that her trousers were made by garment workers, you can see there in Turkey, who earn just $1.49 an hour and are fighting for basic trade union rights, directed us to an old, frequently hidden, but nonetheless painful truth about fashion, the often brutally exploitative conditions of fashion's production. So over 150 years ago in Victorian England in the mid-19th century, these brutal conditions of fashion production drew the excoriating critical eyes of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as they analysed the contradictions of capitalism's productive powers, namely its unique capacity as a system, an economic system or mode of production, to create both marvels but also horrors too. And in the condition of the working class in England, Engels highlighted the plight of the 15,000 mostly young women seamstresses who work for between 15 to 18 hours a day, forced to sleep and eat in their workshop premises. And Engels wrote this about that. He said, "It's a curious fact that the production of precisely those articles which serve the personal adornment of the ladies of the bourgeoisie involves the saddest of consequences for the health of the workers." Now in Capital Volume 1, Marx discussed the textile, garment and fashion industries. And I'm going to come back to this in more detail shortly. But on a personal level, it's interesting to start here. As a casual journalist, what many might see as a precarious worker in today's terms, the struggle to support himself and his family forced Marx to pawn his overcoat in order to put food on the table and keep a roof over his family's heads. Now this meant that he knew not just the price, the exchange value of his coat as a commodity, but he also knew its symbolic value, its symbolic use, or fashionable value too. So when Marx was forced to go without his long black coat, as the historian Peter Stalibras points out, he was unable to study because the British Library reading room wouldn't admit him, they wouldn't let him in. A man without an overcoat, Marx discovered, was deemed not fit to enter. Now that personal judgment of Marx's appearance is important. It was important. It is important because it captures the way in which fashion emerged to symbolically express an ideology of individual and social identity with the rise of capitalism in Europe about 300 or 400 years ago. And the fashion historian and theorist Elizabeth Wilson, in a book there called Adorned in Dreams, argues that whilst the symbolic use of adornment to indicate group belonging or social identification, whether through clothing, through jewellery, through body paint, through makeup, scarification, piercing and so on, whilst that dressing the body is found in all cultures, fashion by contrast emerges with capitalism as a particular style or mode, a form of dress in which, she says, the key feature is rapid and continual changing of styles. Now, under feudalism, it's really an agrarian life of social isolation without any concept of individual identity or the possibility of any social mobility to be expressed. Dress was more or less a static series of socially and hierarchically regimented drapes and robes. But under capitalism, things change. It's an urban society, a city culture. And as you just see by walking here at all, or anywhere, however you got here, it's constant social interaction with strangers on the streets. Where it's the city culture of capitalism is where basically, as Marx and Engels explained in the Communist Manifesto, all fixed, frozen relations, ancient and venerable prejudices are swept away. And all that is solid melts into air. Fashion then, as changing styles of dress emerged. So Wilson argues the capitalist city became a crucible of contradiction. They're her words, and it beautifully sums things up. Capitalism produces a heightened sense of the importance of individual and social identity with dress as one of the key means of expressing, of playing with, of revealing and concealing identity, hence the symbolic weight of Marx's coat. Now, returning to Marx's analysis of the twin workings of class exploitation through wage labour and the appropriation of surplus value from workers it entailed, plus the role of competition between capitalists, this led Marx to produce an astonishingly prescient, insightful analysis of the suffering which prevailed in the Victorian era fashion industry. And this is an analysis, comrades, which I think it's really important to stress, has lost none of its relevance at all today. So Marx attacked fashion's murderous caprices, its changes, the human cost of its cycle of stylistic change. He highlighted, amongst others, the tragedy of a 22-year-old milliner, a hat maker, Walkley, who, he says, worked uninterruptedly for 26 and a half hours before her short life expired. Now, Marx hoped that horrors like this would cease to exist with the invention of what he called the decisively revolutionary sewing machine, which he thought would transform the production of garments through the use of modern industrial methods. But interestingly, it is in the detail of his explanation as to why his hope was not fulfilled that Marx's analysis of the garment industry is most revealing. In the case of textile manufacturing, which provided the raw material for clothing, large-scale mechanization was rapid. Textile mills like that one you see there cut the time taken to make cloth. And as a result, the value of weavers' labour power quickly collapsed, destroying the livelihoods of those who had used hand looms up until about the middle of the 18th century. No longer able to compete by selling the products of their labour, most weavers were forced instead to sell their labour power as a commodity cheaply for wages. But in the case of garment manufacture, industrial development took a different path. In Capital Volume 1, Marx quotes the Children's Employment Commission of 1864, who reported, and I quote, "When work passes through several hands, each takes its share of profits, so the pay which reaches the workwoman is miserably disproportioned." So here, the gradual development of clothing manufacture followed the existing cottage industry or putting out system of dispersed manufacture by a network of home and small-scale producers across the country who worked up clothes from fabric provided by merchant clothiers or clothing merchants. And this meant there was little incentive, the success of that system, to innovate technically and mechanically, when in Marx's terms, Capital's reserve army, that could be a pool of cheap and women's, child, migrant and later global labour, was readily available for exploitation. Middlemen merchants, or merchant clothiers, the forerunners of the subcontracting agents who today play a pivotal role in the global fashion supply chain, became adept, became very skilled at exploiting their greater knowledge of the market for both clothing and clothing manufacture. Now, though the role of these capitalist merchant middlemen or jobbers appeared to mark the continuation of that putting out system in which the majority of seamstresses and clothing workers sold the product of their labour, garments or pieces of garments, not their actual labour power, gradually piece rates were negotiated down by these clothing merchants, forcing wage labour into garment production. So Marx argued something very important in Capital Volume 1. He argued this, that fixing the rate or the amount paid for each garment by the middlemen merchants, clothing merchants, removed any control over the labour process by the garment workers, those garment producers. And he wrote this: payment by the piece ensured, as he puts it, the quality and the intensity of the work which went into making, in this case clothes, was controlled by its very form of payment. So really importantly then, piece rates provided the mechanism by which artisanal garment workers became, in reality, de facto wage labourers. If workers could now produce the garments which made up the value of their wages in 2 hours, say, instead of 3 or 4 in a 10-hour day, then this left an even bigger slice of the value that they created as surplus value for the clothier, the clothing merchant. Now, in a vicious circle of ever faster work rates, aimed at producing enough garments to work up a semblance of a living wage and to raise productivity, this reduced the value of each piece of clothing. So worse still, in a pattern which again persists today, Marx argued piece wages then enhanced the profits of the middlemen and clothing retailers by encouraging even further subletting or subcontracting or sweating, as we know it, as the home or small producer gave out work to other small producers, or indeed to within his family members, even to children, to try and make more garments to compensate for the fall in the value of each. Now remember, Marx is talking here about the mid to late 19th century. The pattern is very, very, very similar, if not identical today. Finally then, Marx argued when mechanization eventually appears in garment making in the 1850s, you may well have one of these at home that's very similar, and that's very significant, because basically garment manufacture still relies on these things. When mechanization eventually appeared in garment making in the 1850s, the size and cheapness of the sewing machine, as fixed capital, proved decisive, because what it did, it was encouraging and encouraged intense competition between small manufacturers. Cheap and small enough to be used anywhere, Marx pointed to the competition which, I quote, raged in direct proportion to the number and in inverse proportion to the size of rival capitals involved in sewing machine-based garment production. Now, these exploitative and competitive dynamics identified by Marx then so incisively a half a century ago continue to mean a constant entry into and exit from the market for fashion manufacture in Bangladesh, in Vietnam, Myanmar, which was Burma, in North African countries such as Morocco, Indonesia, and other developing countries, and here, and in countries which border the huge EU market today, such as Turkey and the former Soviet bloc countries, Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland, small garment-making firms continually underbid each other, competing for contracts from the agents who subcontract work for today's clothing merchants, their equivalent, the large global garment retailers, garment retail chains. So whilst the likes of Walmart, and we all know these names, we're so familiar with them, Primark, The Gap, H&M and Arcadia, the home of Topshop and Topman, have now outsourced and minimised the risks and costs associated with garment manufacture, clothing workers continue to pay the highest price for the inflated corporate profits, which allow fashion magnates such as Philip Green to lounge about. I'm sure you can see him now on his £100 million super yacht. Which one might it be this week? Which one might it be next week? On the 24th of April 2013, the Rana Plaza garment factory in Dhaka, Bangladesh, collapsed. And 1,134 workers died, and thousands more were seriously injured, making clothes for Primark, for H&M, for Benetton, and other global fashion chains. Less an accident than an act of industrial genocide, social murder, to use Engels' highly suggestive phrase. Rana Plaza exposed then the deep and extreme jeopardy faced by the 40 million subcontracted workers who produce high street fashions. Overburdened with too many workers, too many orders, too much machinery, illegal extra floors, built without regulation on swampy ground, garment workers were forced, despite their protests, to enter, to work and to meet their deaths in a building which was visibly cracking apart at the seams. Now, as images of this horror spread across our screens, Marx's analysis of how capitalism alienates, capitalism obscures and commodifies the social labour which makes the magic of fashion happen, then was never ever more apposite. In Capital Volume 1, he argues, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities, but, he continues, it is nothing but a definite social relation between people assuming the fantastic form of a relationship between things. Now, this argument, the core of his theory of commodity fetishism, captures the gap between fashion's appearance as a visual feast from catwalk to high street and its origins in and continued existence through the exploitation of socially productive labour. However, and it's important to say, Marx's analysis of what he famously called the hidden abode of production is not the only aspect of his work relevant to understanding fashion. His analysis of both the astonishing creativity of human labour, the capacity which he said defines our species being, human labour, creative labour, the thing that distinguishes us from all other animal species, and yet the simultaneous frustration, distortion and alienation of those very same productive powers under capitalist class relations, which means we lose control of both our labour and its products, points us towards deeper contradictions within fashion, popular culture and the so-called cultural industries. When it comes to the creative potential of human labour, Marx's writing is really at its most vivid, its most beautiful and its poetic. So again, in Capital Volume 1, he writes this: spiders conduct operations which resemble weavers, and bees construct honeycomb cells. But what distinguishes the worst of architects from the best of bees is that the architect builds the cell in their mind before constructing it in wax. And elsewhere in his writings, Marx continues, unlike animals, who he writes produced one-sidedly, to meet immediate needs, human beings produce universally. He says even when we are free from physical need and truly only produce in freedom from need. For Marx then, labour as our species being involves conscious creative design and aesthetic production beyond necessity. And this makes our production uniquely cultural since, as he puts it, human beings alone form objects in accordance with the laws of beauty. Now in Capital Volume 1, Marx defines commodities as things that engage both wants of the stomach, that is bodily or practical needs, and as he puts it, wants of the fancy, of the mind, of the imagination. So interestingly then, these words call to mind the very quality of fashion, the thing which makes it such a pervasive, everyday cultural force. The duality, the two sides to adornment, all the things that we wear and the things that we dress ourselves with. Far removed from academic caricatures of Marx as some sort of crude, mechanical materialist, his words capture fashion's essence, namely that it is a play of form with and over function. So we do not just wear shoes for their utility or for protection. We wear specific styles of shoes, whether loafers, heels, brogues, boots or trainers, for social, for symbolic, and also for aesthetic reasons. So at the heart of Marx's work lies this richly capacious concept of human labour. But though both he and Engels praise, and this is important to stress, isn't it, praise capitalism for developing our productive potential in the Communist Manifesto, they also savagely attacked the bourgeois epoch as a world in which this fantastic wealth of commodities is created by exploiting the many, whilst their enjoyment is restricted to the few. Now, under capitalist class relations then, instead of the freedom and pleasure they promise, markets determine access to commodities and all the wonderful use values that they can have on the basis of access to money or access to credit. And so our consumption, just like our production, is alienated and it's contradictory. So today, even in the developed world, few, so-called developed world, few can afford to make genuine choices about the clothes and the things that they buy without unease about their finances, their bodies. The beauty and fashion industries carefully set up and exploit those anxieties by promoting often unobtainable bodily ideals and of course offering their products, whether cosmetic, creams, interventions, physical regimes, dieting, fitness or looks and styles as the means through which to resolve, to assuage, to massage away, to treat these insecurities and anxieties. Now many feminists have rightly criticised fashion for objectifying and commodifying women's bodies, contributing to damaged self-esteem, body dysmorphia, eating disorders, and these are things which increasingly affect now men too. Alongside more general concerns about the social and ecological costs of consumption, there is the cloying sense kind of nagging away that, as John Berger argues in his wonderful book Ways of Seeing, the gap between the self as imagined in fashion and marketing images and advertising and the self as it is cannot and never will be bridged by purchase, by consumption. So when it comes to fashion then, it remains, as Elizabeth Wilson once put it, borrowing from another writer like Werner Sombart back in the 1920s in Germany, it's the child of capitalism. Though the best of fashion design can be exemplary of that human capacity to produce beyond necessity that Marx so vividly describes, these are images from some of the work of the late Da Vinci designer Alexandra McQueen, whose V&A Victoria and Albert Museum retrospective was so appropriately for fashion entitled Savage Beauty. Fashion's production and consumption embodies the worst of capitalism's contradictions. Because fashion, though, in all its forms of bodily practices and dress, from shaving, piercing and tattooing, to clothes, to footwear and hair, expresses a sense of our identity, layering culture on and into the body. It can demonstrate both compliance and defiance of authority and of normative sexual, racial and class-based stereotypes. So fashion plays a key role in constructing and potentially deconstructing gender binaries. Oppositions like trousers for men, skirts for women, blue for boys, pink for girls, makeup for girls, not for boys, and so on. So most famously here then, in the 1970s, David Bowie used dress and the body to perform his glam rock alien alter ego Ziggy Stardust in the attempt to critique and rewrite gender boundaries and societal perceptions of sexuality. In the 1960s, the Black Panthers expressed their resistance to racism in line with the wider Black is Beautiful counter-aesthetic by adopting a uniform, blue shirts, black pants, black leather jackets, black berets and black shades. Elements of this style and this look were subsequently taken up by hip-hop bands like Public Enemy, NWA, and most recently people may have seen this with Beyonce's styling of her dance troupe at the 2016 Super Bowl celebrations, which she did in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter campaign in the United States. So in the post-war decades too, creative combinations of music and fashion produced youth subcultures. The Teds adopted and adapted the Edwardian drape jacket with bootlace ties and crepe-soled shoes, brothel creepers to try to break out of the abject alienation that they faced. Hippies in the 60s and 70s grew long hair and made up patchwork jeans, made them up and fixed them instead of buying new ones. And most recently, hip-hop musicians and rappers adopted designer sportswear brands and flamboyant jewellery, so-called bling, as a mixture of comment on and much more straightforwardly embrace of the mythology of the American dream, individualism, consumerism and so-called entrepreneurialism. Now, although each subculture was subject to the crushing circuits of alienation, commodification and appropriation, and they all embodied many contradictions, at best attempting the imaginary resolution of class contradictions. That's the words of Dick Hebdige in a classic study of youth subcultures, Resistance Through Style, written in the late 70s. Although they did this, we should not lose sight of the fact of their wider social origins, their political roots, and the dynamics of these forms of symbolic expression and resistance lie in class society and its gender and its racial and its sexual oppressions. Really significantly then, for example, without post-war immigration, Caribbean migration, there would have been no skinheads, no mods, there would have been no ska. Because it was the Windrush generation, the rude boys, young men from the Caribbean with their sharp suits and pork pie hats, you can see there, which inspired all of those so-called British subcultures. Now, just to bring things to a close, and to reassure the chair, he's all going to finish on time. In Capital Volume 1, Marx drew attention to the work of the 17th century political economist, you can see in there, looking very severely at you, Nicholas Barbon, who captured the centrality of fashion to capitalism. In particular, to the circulation of value, to money, circulation of money, and therefore to the realisation of profit. Barbon wrote, and this was in 1650 or 1690, he wrote, "Fashion, or the alteration of dress, is a great promoter of trade because it occasions the expense of clothes before the old ones are worn out." Over the last 10 years, we've seen a speed up of the cycle of fashionable obsolescence driven by the commercial demand to increase corporate sales and the turnover of low-margin high street clothing. So moving to a close, the fashion then, as for other cultural industries and parts of popular culture, the drive to make a profit trumps in the end both wants and fancies, alienating and distorting the creative potential displayed by the workers whose social labour creates it across the global supply chain. And finally, then comrades, using Marx's work, we can explain not only why designers suffer a loss of creativity, consumers greater anxiety, and garment workers are forced to risk life and limb, but how it will only be with the overthrow of capitalism and its exploitative, mystifying market relations through collective struggle that we will truly, socially and individually liberate our creative powers.
Just a question, because I know the talk was on capitalism and fashion, but certainly in the Tudor times there were things like clothes laws, where people weren't allowed to wear certain colours, or ermine was only for the greater nobles, fox for the lesser nobles, things like that. And it was clearly, fashion was used as a way of identifying the ruling class amongst themselves, and to make sure that there wasn't any usurpers from these heralded positions. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. And the second thing is, of course, the Silk Road must have been one of the great tribunes of ideas, religion, etc. And how do you see the sort of role of materials sort of play out through the various modes of production? And the last thing is I'm sure you're right about the acceleration of consumption in the last few years. My mum used to do outwork for Marks and Spencer's, which is basically where a guy would bring a sack full of clothes and she would be expected to mend it for Marks and Spencer's at home, because she had 3 kids, etc. Very exploitative, but that still goes on. I mean, in Beeston, in Leeds, I know Asian women in particular are given things like shower curtains and get an absolute pittance per head. Yet, on the one hand that's going on, but on the other hand you have this mass production of clothes, those companies. So I wondered if you had any comments. So thank you very much for a really interesting talk. It's good.
Okay, hello. Thank you so much for your talk. I thought it was the talk that I was most excited about at Marxism, actually. I am a member of the SWP. I also work in fashion, and I think it's an area that is ripe for discussion, and there's so much to say about the fashion industry, and I don't think we're going to cover all of it today at all. I've written a couple of things down here, so I don't know if I'm going to get time to mention all of them. One of them was talking about the role of capitalism and how that played in. What's interesting about the Industrial Revolution is the gender divide that comes into fashion. You have the development of the men's formal suit in the beginning of the 19th century, and if you look before that in fashion history, it's men whose style really changed very much. It was men who wore lots of different styles, and women's silhouette didn't really change too much for quite a long time. And it was, after the Industrial Revolution, fashion then became used as a tool, I think, in the oppression of women in terms of telling them, this constantly changing parameters of what it means to be beautiful and fashionable, and you having to keep up, whereas men, I think, operate slightly outside of that. What else did I write down? There's also exploitation. I mean, the fashion industry, I think, engenders exploitation at all different levels. You didn't really talk about this very much, and again, because it's a massive topic, but the fashion production at kind of maybe within the fashion capitals, shall we say, fashion production within like advertising, fashion magazines, you know, for example, internships. Like I've been an intern before, and it's massively exploitative and also very prohibitive for working class people to get into fashion. It's completely the playground of the rich. And there's a real, I also work in a model agency, and there's a real disdain for A, interns, and B, models. You know, there's a real kind of like, there's a really ugly side of, which I think is part of this whole kind of question. Wrote down a lot of things. The other thing, just to finish on, was that I went to the Women's Day march in March this year on International Women's Day, which was largely quite, it wasn't very exciting at all. Politically, it was quite boring. But there was an amazing speaker who's a union worker from Bangladesh, and she spoke very passionately about the cheapness of clothes in the West and who is paying for those clothes. And what she said, it was really powerful. She was saying we as in women in countries like Bangladesh are paying for we're paying for that cheapness with our youth, with our education, and with our lives. And I thought that was fantastic. So thank you again for me.
I thought it was an excellent talk. You know, it showed very, very graphically that the exploitation of the system, it hasn't changed so much since Marx's day. In fact, it has intensified. I mean, the picture we saw from in Bangladesh is absolutely horrible, isn't it? But also, I think the speaker mentioned a little bit about how fashion, it can play a rebellious role or resistant role, you know, within the system. I am from Latin America, and I belong to a tribe called the Mapuches. Now, if anyone sort of has been to Latin America, you could still see, you know, a very sort of, you know, typical fashion-looking people. If you go, for example, to Guatemala, they dressed, you know, in a very sort of colorful way, which it has nothing to do with the Western fashion, really. You know, no multinational company sort of makes their clothes. They made it themselves and so on. And also in Peru and Bolivia, you do have indigenous people sort of, you know, dressing as their old ancestors did. Now, this is part of a cultural resistance, really. A cultural resistance in terms of racism, discrimination, and so on, you know. So fashion can play certain role. But at the end of the day, fashion, it won't change the world. I think this wonderful picture that the speaker showed to us is the point of departure. I think, you know, the only way that we can live in a truly sort of, you know, free society is when the great majority of the population rise up and overthrow this really insane, criminal, violent system, really. We live in an era which is very, very dangerous. Not only, you know, that we can blow up the whole earth by nuclear war, but the race of, you know, racism, discrimination, homophobia, and so on. Fashion is an element of resistance. But, you know, the central key question, or the key political task, an epoch task, I could say, is when the working class and its sort of, you know, allies rise up against this oppression and suffocation of the system.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the incident in Bangladesh that the speaker put up, because I spent quite a bit of time in Bangladesh. Half my family lived there, and I think it's a very interesting thing, because I think we see with it is how capitalism really becomes its own gravedigger in a way, because without the fashion industry, without those things, for women in Bangladesh, the kind of the women of the class who are working in these factories, they wouldn't be in a workplace. Those women would be individually as maids in houses, which is the only acceptable form of labour for women in Bangladesh, or they'd be married off at home. So, That isn't to say this is a good thing, but what it has created is a working class. It has created women being in a workplace with other women. And it is mainly women, because when the garment workers come out at 9 o'clock in the evening, it is the only time when you actually see women walking alone on the streets as groups of women. So again, you know when the garment factories are kicking out, because that's the time when you actually see women coming out. And for a lot of women, they sort of view this work as awful and as terrible and as poorly paid and as awful as the conditions are, as a sense of freedom, as a way of being out of the family and being able to earn a living. But what you actually saw was that this was an absolutely horrendous thing. And we know about this one, but actually it's not the only garment factory that has collapsed. Many, many, many more smaller factories collapsed. And when you drive around the city, you see buildings that are tottering and you think, surely this is a derelict building. Surely nobody can be working in here. And you see the lights on as evening comes and people are working in them. But what you actually saw after this was an absolute shutdown of the city, and women came onto the streets along with men, and they had what they call hatha there, which is where the entire city is shut down. Nothing moves for 3 days in strike. And this is I think this is how you kind of see that capitalism forces people into factories, into terrible conditions, but then it creates conditions in which people can actually unite together to fight back against those awful conditions.
Yes, my name's Carol, and I've studied fashion in the past in the art colleges. Well, that's another area that we have to cover when we see that a lot of art colleges are now closing their doors to any mature students, or the idea of mature students. I've noticed the look of fashion has taken a turn for the worse. But let's also look at it with capitalists. They use fashion as a form of social control. And the girls are put across as being stick thin in these magazines. And is it any wonder that we get increases of girls, once again, suffering from bulimia, or the other thing, which is anorexia nervosa. And recently, up until a few months ago, I was doing some fashion buying. The one thing that I did discover is what are now known as size 6 dresses. Well, what are these dresses supposed to be put on? A doll? Is that what capitalism wants? Equate women to dolls? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Just thank you for the talk. I thought it was brilliant. What struck home to me was right at the end when you said about the speed of fashion changes. Having a daughter who's nearly 18 years old and into her clothes, I am constantly surprised at how often she wants to or has to go shopping down to Cardiff, because the fashions change so quickly. And the pressure that puts on working class families. Actually, I haven't got a bad job, I'm a nurse, you know, but on some of her friends' families, it's a terrible burden, that this constant pattern you've got to go through, you know. And one funny thing that she says to me is, Dad, I see photos of you with me as a baby, and you've got the same clothes on now as you got on then. I say, well, they're worn out, man. She said, it was a disgrace. You can't go out with you unless you buy some new clothes. So that's funny. But the question, I got a question as well. For my sins, I follow football, Cardiff City, whatever. And you see some football fans with these clothes on, Stone Island clothes and all this stuff. It is super expensive. And I wonder if the speaker or anyone else have got any idea, actually, are they any more expensive to make, or is the companies that advertise and sell these things just making more money? Because I think I saw a program once on the television where there was a factory in India making 2 lots of jeans, one for Ralph Lauren and one for Asda or something, you know. They were making the same jeans. One was slightly different, and one's 100 quid and one's £10 or whatever. So does, you know, the companies like Stone Island and all that, are they just, you know, creaming more profit off? Thanks.
Yeah, fashion. To me, it's quite contradictory. I remember when I joined the party, miners' strike. I came from a place called Grantham, which people might know where Margaret Thatcher was born, and it's quite a Tory town. And if you wear sort of unusual clothes, then you stick out and you get stared at, and I purposely used to wear unusual clothes as a bit of a resistance, I suppose, in terms of I wasn't going to conform. And I do hate the way that schools are dictating to kids what they can wear, and I think a lot of it reinforces social gender stereotypes and that. And like my daughter recently was told she couldn't do handstands in the playground unless she had shorts on underneath, because it wasn't very nice, to do it without shorts. And there's all that stuff about working class kids aren't allowed to show the individuality in their haircuts or anything. It's like a uniform, and schools are a bit like factories, but I think they also come across as like armies. It's all about disciplining the working class kids so that, they can't be individuals. So in that sense, I like fashion in terms of people expressing themselves. And people argue, I suppose, like the McQueens and that like haute couture and all that is like art, fashion's like art, but art, a picture on the wall, doesn't make me hate myself. Fashion and cosmetics and all that, they just feed into that self-loathing. And we're all children of capitalism, and I remember we all admit to having, well, I do, like 6 different types of mascaras, and one will make your lashes longer, but now it's not enough to have a mascara. You've got to have false eyelashes, you've got to have false nails, you've got to have very unusual coloured skin, that's not natural. And you just got to, it's just, must be just such a headache, really, to keep up with this. And also this whole thing about your body and that. But so, although we could say like fashion is a sign of human beings being different than animals in terms of the creativity, I actually would hope that when we get rid of capitalism, we won't give a fuck what we look like, really, because we'll be liberated and it won't matter. I'm not saying we'll all wear the same clothes, but I just don't think it will matter as much.
I was encouraged by the last speaker about the attitude of schools to school uniform, and I just thought I'd share this with you. This was from the Metro on Friday yesterday, which says, and it's all relevant to the current heat wave. It says, call for school, boys wear skirts in protest. And it says, fed up boys have begun wearing skirts to school in protest of the ban on wearing shorts in summer. And one of them is quoted as saying that the girls wore trousers and the boys wore skirts instead. And people should have a closer look at this. This is a wonderful picture because actually you can see the pride in these boys' faces wearing skirts. Now this is, interesting, would this have happened, to a decade ago or not? I suspect not. And it shows me, the fact that people are able to adopt this, attitude and challenge to authority, and the fact that they can actually put on a protest in sleepy Torrington and Devon to actually do something, and I'm sure we'll win them, a little victory. And it's the little victories that will make the revolutionaries of the future.
Hi, Anthony from Chesterfield branch. Now, it's good that somebody mentioned football. I gather that a lot of football kids rather have been made in the third world using very exploitative labour, and the thing about sports clothes is it's not just in the third world that there's heavy exploitation. I'm from Chesterfield, which is not a million miles away from the Sports Direct warehouse in Shirebrook, and there a couple of years ago the shit hit the fan about the case of a woman who was pregnant, who wasn't even allowed time off work and ended up having a baby in the toilet, and there's been lots of cases of people suffering things like heart attacks at work due to the heavily exploitative conditions there. Now, with Sports Direct, they employ quite a lot of people from Eastern Europe, and what we've been doing there is to break down the barriers between the Eastern European workers and the British workers there. Is we've been unionising, using leaflets in Polish and what have you, and with and Unite the Union have been putting on English classes for the Polish workers, so they can be taught, among other things, their rights at work. So we've been basically, rather than pandering to all of the crap we keep hearing about immigrant workers undercutting us, we've been basically trying to unionise everyone and to bring and to sort of launch a fight back that can bring the working conditions there up for everybody.
Hey, just a question really. I've seen a lot of questions and issues arising in fashion surrounding like cultural appropriation and stuff, where Western companies will make a lot of profit from designs and clothing pretty much stolen from other cultures. So, don't know, because in some senses it seems multicultural in a way, but then in others it seems exploitative. So, I wonder what you're saying on that.
Yeah, firstly, just say fascinating talk, and it's also great to see someone else from Essex. It's brilliant. So, two questions really. Just firstly, is there, within capitalism, is there a limit to how much rebellion using fashion you can use in terms of, especially in terms of capitalism, to where it reaches the commodification of everything? And secondly, is there a distinction in present-day society between ruling class fashion and working class fashion? And if there is that distinction, is it still important?
I agree, it's a fantastic talk, really enjoyed it, and I agree with people who say it's very contradictory. I think the comrade who spoke from Cardiff about regular purchases, I think it is absolutely right. It does feel very much increasingly that young women, particularly as part of women's oppression, isn't it, that pressure to dress in a very sort of, in a way that is part of resistance but is also very homogenous. And I think it's really interesting. I always think it's really interesting to go into H&M, particularly at the moment, to have an understanding about the politics of young women around feminism. You get all the time this kind of girls support girls to the front, and it's obviously, I just find it really interesting. At the moment they've got a lot of stuff around LGBT plus liberation, which is really brilliant to see, and it's quite interesting. I think the resistance thing, one thing I wanted to mention was these YouTube makeup channels, which often the time again are quite homogenous, but you're seeing a really increasing number of young boys doing these channels, and I think that's a really kind of exciting part of resistance. And so a lot of the channels are very tedious and mainstream, but obviously they can be very transgressive as well. And any person in the room who identifies as a woman will understand how easy it is to resist capitalism just by like not shaving your legs and being in the kitchen, and you're done, and it's great. And with your own body. And I think body positivity movement, for all its problems, which it undoubtedly does have, has been quite positive development overall in terms of sort of challenging the idea about how your body
should look. I was reminded the comrade who spoke about Latin America, about a display in the British Museum. I can't remember where in the world. It was a First Nation community in North America where the clothing, traditional clothing, was banned, and the wearing of it became, an act of resistance. And again, a really interesting example, a very sort of profound example of how clothing can be used. I was glad you talked about Alexandra McQueen. I really like fashion, really enjoy it as an aesthetic thing. I went to see an exhibition, people might know the designer Dries van Noten from Antwerp, and he had a great exhibition over there about all his artistic influences, paintings, poetry, loads and loads of different stuff. And I really enjoy fashion in the sense of the aesthetic. I love wearing bright clothes, and I always have a texture and colour and stuff. And I think I'd be quite sad if we lost that after socialism. I wonder what your and I really take the point of the comrade who said that maybe we shouldn't care anymore. And I think I perhaps kind of don't agree with myself completely. I can't quite decide. No wonder what people think what fashion will be like after capitalism, because I always think it's quite a nice day to look out and see lots of bright colours and textures. And I enjoy it as much as you might architecture or so-called fine art. And just wanted to share that really.
Yeah, following on from the last comrade, I'd love to wear women's dresses. I'd love to. I love going shopping with all my partners who have been women mainly. And you can see sometimes in the shops that there's a certain reaction. Sometimes women kind of, or men, if I'm looking at women's clothes, and it's often women working in there, will have quite a nice reaction, but sometimes there's a bit of a strange reaction, because I go in and I'm genuinely looking at the clothes and say, get this, try this on, look at this, Brilliant, because women's clothes, until recently, is so much more interesting than men's. So much more. I think it's changed a lot, which is good, and that kind of leads me on to the idea that it's very clear fashion can oppress us completely. We've gone through that. But there is another side to it I think we have to be sensitive to. It's the act of rebellion. It's the acts of trying to profess our individuality, not in a bourgeois sense, but to stand out from the shit of life. I mean, even today, at 53 years of age, from when I was 16, I love Fridays because it's the end of the working week and I want to put my best clothes on and I want to go out or even sit in the house and I just want to feel nice. Why am I doing it? Because I want to get away from work and from the monotony and I want to feel different and I want to celebrate the weekend. For Christ's sake, we work enough long hours, don't we? And so there is a side to fashion and clothes that I think we really mustn't write off. It's all alienation. Of course it is that, there's no doubt about that. And the other thing is also, I think, within fashion we can get a sense of movements of change because of, the boys wearing skirts and how now transgender and our change in sexuality, we can see how people are expressing themselves differently. And that's fantastic. And the other thing is that there is a move amongst all of us, however problematic it is, a bit like the positive body images and that, is that people are getting the sense of the Rana Plaza disasters. People want to try and buy ethical clothes or things like that, and people are grasping towards an idea that maybe someone else is paying the expense of my cheap clothes, And I think we've got to be, as I say, sensitive to that. There is a problem with that sort of ethical trade and ethical capitalism, but it begins to allow us to connect with people who want to see and do something about the world. So fascism, Freudian slip there. I did say to comrades, I'm going to the meeting on capitalism and fascism. They're like, what? No, it's fashion. But anyway, there is a link there, yeah. But I think, fashion is something that, it's a place where we can begin to meet people. And of course, in some ways, it's a great way to meet people. There's nothing better than getting dressed up. I know you'll say you don't think I do that wearing a t-shirt like this. But there is something brilliant and liberating about fashion. But of course, there is a limit to it as well.
Thanks, Tony. It was a great talk. I'm from Harlow SWP and I'm in the NEU, I work in education. I've got a question that I'm going to ask first because I think I've got some other things to say, so I'm going to ask this first because otherwise I'll forget. This arises from a conversation between my son and a young woman friend who came around to the house. The young woman said that she was going to get a young white woman, my son's white, young white woman who said she was thinking about getting her hair done in cornrows, in the traditional African style. And my son immediately said, oh, you can't do that because that's cultural appropriation. Absolutely no way you can do that. So there was a bit of a discussion, and I thought I'd kind of leave that one, and we had another comrade talk a little bit about that. The other thing that I'm really fascinated by, and I don't know how many of you are aware of this sort of phenomenon, is the obsession that some young people have with watching RuPaul's Drag Race. Now, I've had a look at it, and to me it just kind of expresses the kind of worst, I don't know, forms of, people competing with each other, or transvestites competing with each other and being actually quite unpleasant about each other and quite competitive. But my son argues that it's actually a really high form of artistic expression, and he just watches it programme after programme after programme, and he's not the only young person that does that. The other thing I wanted to talk about, 'cause I'm in education, I'm an educational psychologist, so I go into schools and sort of problem solve around young people's psychological dilemmas and things. I've had quite a few debates and discussions recently about gender questioning young people, and how schools respond to that in terms of uniform. And often what seems to happen is that although there's this idea that, okay, we're an inclusive school, we're open to ideas about gender and young people wanting to transition and so on and so forth, but quite often they'll insist that the young person chooses one gender or another because they want to maintain the genderedness of the school uniform, which I think is quite interesting. And often there's also, it goes along with a kind of argument about toilets as well. There was another thing I wanted to say and I can't remember what it was. That'll do. Thank you very much.
I think all of us, in some way, express our individuality somewhere, sometime, in an amusing way. You probably have to think back. I remember a school uniform I had to wear. We always had to wear a school uniform with a tie. Now, the first thing we used to do with our ties was we got those nice, on a tie Windsor knot, but a really big Windsor knot. Like the size of your fist Windsor knot. So the tie used to be about this, it was long. Yeah. I mean, all of us, a big Windsor, every day. It's like, what's the point of us wearing a tie? Because I'm not wearing it properly anyway. but that was the thing we used to always do, the big Windsor knots. Then you look at other people and you go like, I see you're dressing smart, but that's not a Windsor knot. That's a lazy side knot. You think like, no, you look good. Do your tie properly. Nice big knot. But for me, growing up, there was also, I'm not sure if you covered it, so the rejection of fashion. I think I'm probably the least fashionable person ever. It's got a parka. I'll wear a parka. That'll do. Keeps me warm. I wore these jeans. They got holes in my legs. Still fit. Carry on. So they fall off. Huge gaping knees and stuff. Then suddenly that becomes a fashion. I never understood that. Buy ripped clothing. Well, just wear them long enough, they'll rip anyway. It's like, what's next? They're going to sell you pre-broken mobile phones. It's just fashionable. I've got a broken one. I find it really, really, really bizarre that you can buy damaged goods. I've got ripped jeans. Mine are like 7 years old. They're knackered. I eventually get rid of them when my arse falls out or something. I'll give up then. Big pair of boots. Boots last me a long time. I like my boots. I'm wearing these at the moment. I feel absolutely weird. It's like the floor, and they're not fashionable. So I was wondering why you haven't, the sort of rejection of fashion, the rejection of fashionable norms. In the 80s, everyone was like, the new romantics, etc., the goth thing. I just remember, I'm going to turn my jeans up. That'll do, that looks nice. I've turned my jeans up for 20 some odd years, and suddenly it's come back in fashion again. I go, I've done that. so and I think there's a lot of, there's also a rejection of the idea of this commodity fetishism which we get, the idea of worshipping things. And I think that's the problem sometimes. We forget that people end up worshipping items, not actually celebrating themselves. So you chase the next thing. I'm just, that t-shirt I do. I know it's Sunday and I'm supposed to be seeing my mum. She wants to take me out to lunch somewhere. Fuck it, I'm just going how I want to dress. I don't want to wear the big tie anymore.
Melford from Birmingham branch. Just a few ideas. In terms of, I will think fashion probably, when we get rid of capitalism, will be fashion is like you sit down and you make your own clothes because you're not relying on somebody to make it for you and the label that you buy. I mean, for me, I grew up in South Yemen, which is belong to the communist time. So everybody dressed up like everybody. So there is no significant difference. We all look the same. We all, my mom will queue and get the same clothes that all the society will have. So there's nothing really significant. So we learn about personality. We individual in our personality, in our experiences, rather than our clothing and what we wear. And I was lucky as well. My mom was a tailor, so me and her sit down and say, I want to wear, Eid is coming, so she designed clothes for me, so I said, no, I want it this way. So I will think probably fashion will be like we dressed up how we want to individually, we design our own clothes, or we sew our own things rather than rely on others to do it for us, and we buy it and pay that way. The other point I wanted to say, I don't know if people are aware, is that my daughter is going 16 soon, and she's been through what is it called? Instagram, which is manipulated by companies that actually asking young people to promote their own product. And she was telling me she can make money. And I'm saying, how you do that? And she said, I'll promote this or that product that the company put me in. And she actually, I thought, okay, go on, let's see what you're talking about. I mean, for me, it's like Instagram is just like, whoa, I don't know anything. I don't want to even know. And she actually got, I think, £40 or something voucher. So she said, I've got £40, what you want from Amazon? So, it's just like getting young people to, exploiting young people to promote products for companies. I found it quite, disgusting really. So I thought I'll throw that. I don't know if people, got, privilege to get teenage our days. So this is something beyond us. This is a different market that probably we don't know about exploiting.
Thank you. That was a really good talk. Thank you very much for that. I would just like to raise the point on the rise of second-hand shopping. I know like a few years ago, if you told someone, I got that from the charity shop, they'd be like, But these days I'm like, I got my skirt from the charity shop. And they're like, oh wow, that's a really cool skirt. So just if you'd like to bring any, no, this one. I fell into capitalism. So if you could talk about that in terms of capitalism, that kind of context. And then secondly, touching on the topic that was brought up by someone on cultural appropriation, I think that's very relevant. For example, I lived in Spain for the past couple of months, and being there in the area which I lived in, not a lot of diversity. I was one of very few black people there. And someone came up to me and they're like, I want to do my hair like that. I had braids in at the time. And with cultural appropriation, it's the thing of, do you know why my hair is like that? Do you understand the history behind my hair? Do you understand that? If you understand that, then I can understand, okay, you want to get your hair like that because you think it's a fashion statement, and in some ways that I can understand you want to exercise your individualism, and that's okay, but get to know the history behind things. For example, I do believe it was Stella McCartney who did a print. It was a typically African print that she rebranded, and she sold it for like thousands. And it was like, whoa, do you understand the history behind that? So I think it's very important that we understand history when it comes to appropriation and like appreciation rather than appropriation. I think that's very important. So, thank you.
I thought it was a fantastic talk, and maybe it's just me, I'm a little bit perturbed by the way that some of the contributions have gone, because I think we're so enthralled to the fashion industry and it feels very much part of us, what we wear, and our identity, that it's very hard to think about who makes it, why it's made, who makes the money from it, and what happens to the people that make these things. My partner is a very good friend who works in the industry, and she makes prints and she now has gone freelance because she couldn't actually afford to live working for a company. She's actually finding freelance really, really hard, and she can't afford to pay her rent. What it is, and she makes prints for companies. What it is, they're the prints, the fashion prints that go on shirts and t-shirts, and they can then be sold to very high class, if you like, companies or Primark. The company made a lot of money out of these prints. She, as an individual worker, got exactly the same amount of money, which is hardly anything, even though it's her design, from her head, her design. She didn't own it, the company owns it, alienated, totally exploited, and she made exactly the same amount of money, whether or not it was a print that went to Primark and sold for like, on a t-shirt that was for like £10 or something, or something that cost £100. So I need to mention co-option. Co-option is everywhere, and obviously, so yes, okay, we have t-shirts that are being sold in certain places that have certain slogans that we agree with, whatever. But it's still being sold, it's still making money, and it's still making money for the capitalists. And if they can sell you something with a slogan that encourages you to buy more, that's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, I mean, that was incredible. I mean, I think it certainly has proved that it's definitely been a topic worth addressing at Marxism. I don't think there's been a meeting on it before. And I mean, one of the things about fashion really is it touches on all of us, whether we want it or not. You know, we can be, we think, anti-fashion, but actually, you know, that is only in relation to the concept of fashion. You know, so in a sense, everybody's involved in it. But I think that's also why it's very important. Because this thing about dressing the body is very important, because we all have bodies and we dress them. It doesn't matter whether you think you do or you don't. I don't see anybody sitting in here naked. And even if we all took our clothes off, your body would be fashioned in some way or other. You would or would not have shaved it in certain places, as somebody pointed out very astutely in relation to gender identification conventionally. So I think it's definitely worth the discussion. It's brought out so many really, really interesting and rich things. I mean, I'll try and talk about a few of them, but honestly, it was just incredible. It's quite easy to do in a meeting, but it's actually quite difficult, I found, to come back on all these points. But anyway, let me have a go. So the first thing was about sumptuary laws. I mean, sumptuary laws are actually very, very interesting. Interesting thing about them is that they really came to prominence in about the 13th or 14th century. And that's interesting because that's precisely the time when capitalism is starting to appear. So they try to enforce, in fact, to feudal class social relations through having laws about what colour garments you can wear. So for the peasants, you could only wear brown, gold and purple, gold for the nobles, purple for the nobility, and the type of peasants had to wear hessian. Imagine what that was like. So at this very time, they're trying to control, in the 14th and 15th century, how people dress. Tells us about the society breaking apart in the way that Marx and Engels talked about it in the Communist Manifesto, that it was the society where all those those feudal idols were falling to the wayside, all those old ideas. So it is, you can see that through garments, through dress, through clothing. They couldn't control the emergence of the bourgeoisie. They couldn't stop them. You know, that's the reality about the power of that mode of production and that class. But they did try to control what they could and couldn't wear through these sumptuary laws. But they were basically became left by the wayside. So it's very interesting to think about thing. To do with, oh my goodness, there's so many things. Yeah, to do with the question of gender. Gender and fashion, again, extremely important. I mean, as people have pointed out, it's very difficult to think about gender without thinking it through clothes. You know, without just look at the signs and symbols that are still there on a lot of really antiquated toilets. But we still got these, you know, skirts for women, bifurcated legs for men. I mean, this is something as well which is very, very interesting. It really did emerge, as you said, the comrade who said that she worked in fashion. Something very interesting happened in the 19th century. Bourgeois men renounced display in fashion. It's a thing called the Great Masculine Renunciation. But basically, they then styled themselves using the suit. And the suit was an expression of their sober, bourgeois, business-like asceticism, you know, not wasting money on consumption, because they saw that was the thing that the royalty, that the aristocracy did, and we know that that the class of the bourgeoisie, you know, invested and reinvested as much as, or much more than they did actually spend. So I think that there are very, very deep links around fashion and dress and gender, which I think aren't really often talked about. Even the expressions like who we know who wears the trousers in that relationship. I mean, those kinds of things mean that we shouldn't be overlooking what dress and fashion can really tell us. And then Mario said about the duality of the contradictory nature of fashion, and this is absolutely, you know, the point of the meeting, really. And it's so much the case of nearly all of our cultural lives under capitalism. We think about music. It's a similar kind of position. It's both an expressive form, popular music, but it's also one that's massively commodified and appropriated. You've only got to go to, you know, the V Festival, or whatever festival it happens to be, you know, even Glastonbury. Look at how these great praying capitalist monoliths, Branson and others, are able to try to take control of those spaces that people try to create. But I think really exciting thing about, you know, the thing I think like fashion and music is the way that it has actually shown the potential creativity of working class people, of ordinary people, to actually strive to reach beyond the shit that they live through. And to actually create something. Somebody said that it is about joy, it's about colour, it's about that form of expression of individualism. Somebody said not in a bourgeois way, not in a predatory, cut yourself off way, but in a way of wanting to connect with people. And again, there's a kind of deep strand of radical thinking within fashion. George Simmel, who said that fashion is both about separating yourself and making links with other people, which I think people kind of live through in terms of dress. And Mario talked about resistant forms of dress in Latin America. The stuff about Bangladesh is absolutely horrific, and I think it, you know, to me, the image of, I'm sure it's the case for you, of Rana Plaza, I also now think straight away, I think Grenfell Tower. Social bloody murder. You know, that's what these people do to us. That's what their system do to us. And in the way that we want to live is constantly turned and commodified, is turned into a thing that's to be bought and sold, a thing that in the end kills people, thousands who are making garments, you know, every year, because it isn't just about Rana Plaza. 3 years before that, there was a fire at the Tazreen garment factory, and that killed 112 people. But as well as that kind of really depressing thing, it's also true that there is massive resistance as well from garment workers themselves. I mean, that image is from the Egyptian workers there at the Mahala textile factory. And it's these workers here that were the triggers, really, in the vanguard of the 2011 movement that led to the uprising, the revolution in Egypt, the occupation of Tahrir Square. And it's also very interesting, I mean, honestly, there was so much in the discussion, that was great. But it was very interesting as well, people were talking about, you know, the elements of resistance, and migrant workers, I think, is a very important argument that we need to stress here. If you go back to the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in New York, I think it was in 2012, that factory employed thousands of migrant labourers. They were recently arrived from Germany, forced out of Germany and other countries in Eastern Europe by pogroms. They were Jewish women workers, and it was a Jewish woman worker that led the struggle that created limits on the working day for the Triangle Shirtwaist workers, enforced breaks and gave them greater health and safety protection. And she was a Jewish woman, a machinist, and she was a member of the Jewish Socialist Bund. So it's absolute nonsense to think in any way, shape or form that migrant workers are the cause of cheap labour. In fact, there's something else. Yeah, there's something else which is really important, and it's a slight change in language, which is very significant. It's not cheap labour, it's cheapened labour. And we need to ask, who is cheapening the labour in these places? Who is doing that? It certainly isn't the workers themselves, and time again we've seen this. We can see it more recently in the struggles, you know, around universities like this, which are being led by migrant workers who are forcing up the rate of pay for cleaners across London and elsewhere, not forcing it down. So there were so many things. The thing about cultural appropriation, I think this is really interesting. I think the comrade hit the nail on the head when she said it should be about appreciation, not appropriation. That's very, very important. And I think most people, when they look at style and they want to say something about themselves, because we do not walk around like blank sheets, automata, you know, whether we recognise it or not, we constantly express things about us, our hair. You know, I mean, what do we do with it? So the examples and the discussion around corn dolls and so on is actually very interesting. And I think the problem is it's about commercial appropriation. And it's about things like there's a designer, Matthew Williamson, who a few years back based his whole range at London Fashion Week on Ethiopian national dress, Ethiopian traditional dress. Now, in a sense, that's fantastic. But you know what he also did? He basically tried to then take the create intellectual property on that design, on those motifs. That's what people were really angry about. It's taking something that's in common, a common value for Ethiopian people, that motif which is so important to them. And in the spirit of contemporary neoliberal capitalism, turning that into a property thing, turning that into something that he can own exclusively. Because I do think there is a limit, though, to this argument about cultural appropriation. I mean, I, like a few of my comrades in the room, won't mention any of them, have got a quiff. Where did it come from? It's got a bit flat. You know, charging around London and all this, but in the heat. But basically, where did it come from? And it's a very interesting story. Because, you see, it's about cultural mixing. Because originally the quiff was a style that was adopted by people like Malcolm X, okay, in the 40s and 50s. It was the conch, it was black, young men straightening their hair in emulation of the styles of white men. But then stars like Elvis Presley, rock and roll, rockabilly stars like Elvis Presley saw the style of Little Richard, and they wanted that style as well. So what you get is this chain of borrowing. And I think in the end, ultimately, we should be talking about cultural appreciation rather than appropriation. We should always condemn that kind of naked neoliberal control of cultural values of people, whether they're from Ethiopia or whatever country, and the creation of intellectual property right around common parts of humanity, in fact, and our stylistic creativity. But we should also recognise the limits to that argument, because the truth is, you know, in the words of, say, for example, Paul Gilroy, who wrote a very fantastic book about the links between all our cultures, the Black Atlantic, is that just as I said about the migrants from the Caribbean, from the Windrush generation, they gave us the styles that we've got. But where did they get those styles from? In many ways, those styles emerged from a relationship that they had with in the colonies as colonised people. In other words, it's very difficult to find that point of origin. And in the end, I don't think it's very helpful ultimately to keep looking for it. But we should always be very critical of those that seek to just commercially steal and appropriate simply to make money. And there were so many other really interesting things. Can I just come back on one or two of them? Maybe. I think we've done quite a few of them. There's a couple of things I just wanted to finish off with. Yeah, there was a bit about the drag thing and the drag culture. I mean, again, I've heard lots about this show. I haven't actually seen it, RuPaul's Drag Race. But I do know a bit about, things like, you should also look at the film Paris is Burning. Because what you do get in a system like ours, which tries to crush any individualism, especially, I think it was so telling, that woman who spoke about working class individualism, because that's something, and especially young women's working class individualism, that's something those in authority and power do not like. And I think you're absolutely spot on about that. I mean, it's very interesting, even recently, Tesco's were trying to slap bans, weren't they, on people going shopping wearing onesies. Well, I mean, what's that got to do with them? But it shows you the power of those judgments and stereotypes about working class people. But going back to that RuPaul's Drag Race, I think that within the system, people do try to create spaces, and there were some spaces that were safe, for example, for the transsexual and transgender community through music and fashion voguing clubs in New York in the 1980s. And I think it's probably a part of that kind of subcultural, countercultural resistance, which is probably why it's so attractive now to young people. Because I tell you something that's really important. More and more young people are rejecting the ideology of sex, heterosexual normativity, gender binaries, and so on. These things can be incredibly destructive. And I think they're looking for spaces to understand and explain why we can be anything that we want to be. But I tell you one other thing before we finish. The only space in the end where we can never really be like that, comrades, is after, not before, but after a socialist revolution. Because I think Marx and Engels put it absolutely beautifully in the Communist Manifesto when they said this: in the place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we will have an association, and this is the really important bit, in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. We're not for that competitive, destructive bourgeois individualism, but we are for people truly becoming individuals within a society in which we control our social labour, we control our creativity, and in that society we can wear genuinely whatever we want.